You okay? All right. So yeah, today I'll be talking about a phenomena that's best understood by example. So let me start with the demonstration. So if I showed you this image, this thing in the image, and I asked you, what is it called? What would you call this? Think about what first comes to mind. And I think most of us will probably come to an agreement that we would call this a dog. So we might say, this is a dog. Or conversely, if I said, in my language, I call this a dog, or I call this a wug, this is a wug, then you might think wug means dog, right? So there's a sense in which this dog level of specificity in naming is privileged. And people refer to this phenomena as the basic level bias, as the dog category meaning the basic level category. And it's a well-documented phenomena in both adults and children, where they prefer the basic level across many different contexts of use. And even though we could always be more specific, right? We can say Dalmatian and be more specific at the narrower level. We can say animal and be broader at the superordinate level. And today I want to talk about superordinate nouns. So what makes them different from the basic level, and what do children know about their properties in language? And when it comes to superordinate nouns, there's a long history of reports that they're particularly difficult for children. For example, there's a long line of evidence from classification and matching tasks that children as old as 7 years old have difficulty grouping perceptually dissimilar items that share the same superordinate category. So for example, if you show kids a drawing of a banana and ask them to find the other one, and you show them a choice of a grape or a moon that's in a similar shape, then even 7-year-olds get distracted by the perceptual match to the moon around half of the time, whereas adults always categorically go for the taxonomic match to the grape. And to complicate this picture even further, there's also really puzzling reports of children rejecting superordinate nouns as logically false when you use it for reference. So if you point to a dog and say, this is an animal, then some 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds will say no and treat that like a false statement or a failure of reference. So one perspective that has emerged from these findings is that maybe children's difficulties with superordinate nouns is a matter of conceptual development, right? These superordinate categories, they're very broad, diverse, and abstract and diffused, and so children might need to acquire deeper knowledge about these categories or develop their logical reasoning abilities before these meanings become available for mapping and understanding in language. But here I want to present a different angle of looking at these kinds of difficulties because they might not necessarily be conceptual in nature. And to do that, I'm going to use a demonstration, a puzzle from the New York Times. It's called Connections. How many people have played Connections? Yeah, it's very popular. I'm really glad. Essentially, if you don't know, you're given 16 words in a grid, and you have to group these into 4 groups of 4. So it's kind of like a categorization task for adults. And if you're like me, let's solve this together. So I might start by scanning the first row or two. I might pick out some of the easy words, right? So words with a clear taxonomy like wombat and mole rat. And I might be thinking like animal as a category here. But it turns out that's wrong because there's actually, animal makes a group of 5, not 4, right? So there's also a kangaroo, a koala, and a wallaby. And the answer here is to group 4 of these into marsupials up at the top, and then move mole rat into the category of things that are naked, alongside naked truth and naked eye, right? So that's kind of hard, but in a different sense, because I know what marsupials are, right? Like we know what marsupials are, we probably read about it in a textbook, but the puzzle is difficult because it's hard to see the relevance of that category, right? Like when do we ever talk about marsupials or talk about a kangaroo in its capacity of being a member of the marsupial family? So circling back to children's difficulties with superordinate nouns, we start with the premise that there's this similar kind of a difficulty going on in language of knowing when superordinate meanings rise to the level of being talked about. So even if you know what animal is conceptually, there's a separate question of when you expect the word animal to appear in a conversation, right? So if a children's knowledge of that is still maturing, then that might explain some of their difficulties in these tasks. And in fact, there is indeed some evidence for this kind of a reinterpretation of children's failures as really being pragmatic in nature, as being about seeing the relevance of superordinate categories. So on children's categorization abilities and matching tasks, Markman et al. Found that children make more taxonomic matches if you have them sort objects and put them together into bags, as opposed to rearranging items on a flat surface like a mat. And the explanation for that being that maybe spatial arrangement can actually encourage reasoning about thematic congruence. So for example, people and chairs don't form a taxonomic category, but they do go together spatially in places like theater or a classroom or at a conference. And similarly, on the refusal effect, Waxman and Hatch has shown that if you ask children to correct a false statement that contrasts at the superordinate level, like telling or asking children, is this a plant while pointing to a dog, then they themselves can be led to produce a statement, this is an animal, which they might otherwise reject. Right? So we see some signatures of not yet adult-like, but still pretty sophisticated pragmatic reasoning in these young children. And building on these perspectives, our study asks, what do children know about the pragmatics of superordinate nouns? And specifically, we're going to be looking at children's sensitivity to the informativeness property of superordinate nouns, where we know that superordinate nouns are typically under-informative for reference and naming compared to basic level nouns, right? And this is in part due to the logical entailment relationship. The choice of saying a superordinate noun along a scale of specificity generates the basic level alternative, and the basic level alternative, the lexical alternative, is preferred because it meets the informativeness demands of a generic addressee in your speech community. That's why they're the basic level. So you would never say to someone something like, I took my animal out for a walk this morning. Or in fact, even if you look at corpus data from parents talking to children, they're toddlers who don't know the word animal, they never say this is called an animal. They say this animal is called a dog. They presuppose that fact, right? So these are strong intuitions that we get as adults in comprehension and production, and we think that this kind of pragmatic competence should factor into the story of children's language acquisition and development. And of course, in taking this perspective, we were naturally inspired by the literature on scalar implicatures, which is the kind of implicature that tells you why statements like some dogs are mammals is odd, even though that's logically true, right? So, and just to briefly highlight some of the parallels there, in that literature, we also find initial reports of children's difficulties with generating these implicatures, and that's classically been attributed to childlike processing or representation. But then recent studies have come out to say that, well, actually, if you give children a better chance at seeing the relevance of the pragmatic meaning of some, then they can actually succeed in those tasks. The capacity is there. So we're going to be taking a similar kind of approach in this study. So circling back to the present study, we hypothesized that young children, preschoolers, 4 to 5-year-olds, are sensitive to the informativeness property of superordinate nouns. And we test 2 predictions in 2 experiments. In experiment 1, we test whether children judge superordinate nouns to be under-informative for naming and identifying single reference, familiar reference. And in experiment 2, we test whether this penalty can be reduced if the superordinate level becomes more relevant for the task, right? So local manipulation. So this is the procedure that we had for experiment 1. It was a very simple acceptability judgment kind of a task. We had participants introduced to a character on a screen, Mr. Lion, and Mr. Lion's playing a game of I Spy. So pictures come up on the screen next to Mr. Lion one by one, and Mr. Lion names what's in the picture. And the task is for participants to rate how well Mr. Lion did. And the manipulation, again, what we tested is very simple. So in the critical trials, Mr. Lion named the object in the picture at either the basic level or at the superordinate level. So he said, this is a dog, or this is an animal. And there were 8 critical trials, and this was a within subjects design. And after the labeling, participants rewarded Mr. Lion with one of 3 strawberries, his favorite snack, that varied in size. So a small or medium or large reward. And this 3-way rating scale, by the way, comes from the scalar implicature literature, where people have had success using this to probe exactly the kind of under-informative but not false judgments in preschoolers around the age that we're testing. And specifically for our purposes, these were the instructions that we used for the rating scale. So we said, if Mr. Lion uses a wrong word, then give him the small strawberry. If Mr. Lion uses the best word, give him the large strawberry. And if Mr. Lion uses a word that isn't wrong, but also isn't the best, and you can think of a better one, then give him the medium strawberry. And then, of course, the experiment, we also had fillers involving logically true and false kinds of statements, like failures or successes of reference. And these were done to establish the ends of the rating scale so that we can leave the middle response out for the kinds of infelicitous judgments. And just to get it out of the way, both adults and children categorically succeed at this mapping task. And so I'm gonna describe the prediction. So given that the ends of the scales have been established, what we predict is, for the basic level label condition, like saying this is a dog, then we predicted majority large size rewards, large size responses, because that's both true descriptively and also is a good way of describing what is there. But if Mr. Lyon said this is an animal now using the superordinate label, then that should be judged as underinformative, though not logically false. So we would expect comparatively more mid-sized responses and fewer large-sized responses. And combined, that would be the kind of underinformativeness judgment that we're looking for compared to the basic level. All right, so here's what the data looks like for adults. So the left bar is the superordinate label condition. This is a dog. And then the right bar, or this is an animal. And the right bar is the basic level condition. So this is a dog. And the color of the bars show the distribution of the rewards. So there's red for small, gray for medium, and blue for large. And as predicted, adults judge superordinates to be underinformative compared to the basic level. So in the superordinate condition, if you say this is an animal, if Mr. Lyon says this is an animal, then we see an increase in responses at the mid-size rewards and a corresponding decrease in the blue-size rewards. Right, so our predictions are borne out for adults. What about for children? Or sorry, before we get into children, I want to note this weird thing that happens, which is, even if you have cases where you say this is an animal, adults don't categorically judge that as underinformative, right? The bar is only half gray. So we actually dug into this a little bit. I'll just briefly mention. This is largely driven by individual differences. So we had some adults who always said this is very good, some adults who always said this is infelicitous, some adults who kind of went in between. And this was actually nice to see because this is a classic signature of pragmatic underinformativeness judgment where you don't have this kind of categorically logical or pragmatic people. There's this kind of a variation at the population level. So this was independently interesting to see. Okay, now turning to children's data. We also observed the same underinformativeness penalty, right? So we see compared to the basic level, the superordinate level labels get more mid-sized responses and fewer large-sized responses, right? So children, like adults, think that this is an animal is odd compared to this is a dog because they know, presumably, that dog is the better lexical alternative. So that's experiment 1. And then in experiment 2, we're going to ask whether this kind of a penalty that superordinate labels get is a global dispreference or if that can be modulated by what's relevant in the task. So in experiment 2, children now engaged with both Mr. Lyon and the experimenter in a slightly different game of find a different one, which went like this. So instead of a single image, you now see a grid of 4 images where one of them is a different one. Right, so in this case, we have the same dog target that we saw earlier, but it's now surrounded by 3 vehicles. And the trials start with the experimenter asking Mr. Lyon, hey, Mr. Lyon, this one is different. What is it? And then he identifies what it is by circling or by drawing a red box around it. And Mr. Lyon goes through the same motion of responding by saying what that different one is, right? So he again says, this is a dog or this is an animal. So we keep the same condition. It carries over to experiment 2. But we also cross this labeling condition with another condition which manipulates the makeup of the visual alternatives, right? So in one case on the left, you saw 3 members of the same superordinate category, so 3 different cats. And then on the right, you saw 3 members of a different superordinate category. So again, it's like the 3 different vehicles, like non-animal things. And the idea here is that these visual alternatives should be considered as relevant for Mr. Lyon's choice of word, right? And the crucial prediction is what happens for superordinate level labels, like this is an animal, within these conditions. So in the same superordinate condition on the left, we might expect a similar kind of an underinformativeness penalty because the other things are animals too, right? So this is an animal is again true for what gets the bounding red box, but it's not informative. But then on the right, in the different superordinate condition, we predict that that penalty might actually be reduced because this is an animal is now sufficiently informative. That's kind of the relevant dimension of contrast. So if children can pick up on that, then the penalty might be ameliorated. And then for the basic level labels, this is a dog. As a prediction, it's pretty straightforward. We expect it to be kind of good overall across the board because by design, there's only one dog present. So we kind of expect the same pattern as in experiment 1. All right. This time we're going to look at the data from children first. So I'm going to be showing the same colored bars, except now we'll have a top-level split for the manipulation of the visual alternatives, right? And then at the bottom, you have the labeling conditions. So first, as a sanity check, the basic level label, when Mr. Lion says, this is a dog, that's always good because it uniquely describes a target, right? Not surprising, this is by design. The interesting thing happens when we look at superordinate labels. And here we do see the predicted difference when we manipulate the visual alternatives. And more specifically, this is an animal now gets more large-sized responses from children when the other objects are non-animals, right? So children seem to understand that saying animal here when the target is distinguished by the alternatives because the alternatives are vehicles, that is sufficiently informative and appropriate. Whereas when the other objects are also animals, like different kinds of cats, then this is an animal is underinformative again, because it doesn't speak to why the target is different, because the other ones are animals too. So even though that's a logically true statement, it still gets the underinformativeness penalty, so the data patterns are what we found in experiment 1. Now, what do adults do? Well, it's actually not so exciting. Regardless of what else is visually present in the scene, adults judge this as an animal to be similarly suboptimal, right? Of course, the conclusion shouldn't be that adults are pragmatically insensitive. So we did do a quick experiment just with adults where we replicated experiment 2, but we also asked adults to provide a justification, right? So why would you give Mr. Lion this reward? And when we looked at why adults gave Mr. Lion medium-sized rewards for this is an animal, what we find is that adults actually always generate the basic level lexical alternative, right? So adults always think, well, Mr. Lion could have said dog instead, but he chose animal, therefore underinformative. So they're still engaging with that kind of a reasoning, but almost doing it unprompted, going beyond the local demands of the task. So we think that this is kind of the one big difference that we find between adults and children here. All right, so to summarize the data, we find first in experiment 1 that children can judge superordinate nouns as underinformative for identifying and naming single reference. And at the same time, we also find that children can relax this penalty if the superordinate level becomes the appropriate dimension of contrast for the task. All right, so in conclusion, children can pragmatically reason about the usage of superordinate nouns in language. And I want to highlight kind of the two implications of that. First is, as I noted earlier, we think that this is a kind of a scalar phenomenon. And it's interesting to then see us reaffirm the prior data that children at this age range, preschool year children, can generate these kinds of pragmatic implicatures on the basis of scalar relationships. And then second, kind of circling back to the conceptual debate where this all started, we think that this data might actually be evidence for conceptual competence because it's very difficult to explain this kind of a nuance if the conceptual representation was degraded, right? So if the children didn't have a stable category of animal, or if children didn't understand the entailment relationship between dog and animal, then what we might have seen instead is something like superordinate nouns are globally dispreferred. Right? Instead, that's not what we see. We see children sensitive to pragmatic demands of the task. And then lastly and more broadly, we think that understanding children's pragmatic sensitivities like this might actually inform conditions for word learning. Right? So if children are sensitive to the context in which superordinate meanings are appropriate and expected to appear, then that might also condition the circumstances in which children posit or conjecture superordinate level word meanings when they're doing word learning. So again, I just want to highlight that the challenge of superordinate noun learning, even though this just seems like mapping labels onto things that we see and touch in the world, it isn't just about having the concepts. It's also this deeply pragmatic question of when you expect superordinate level meanings to be talked about in language. Thank you.
Oh no, I'm too short. I love that conclusion.
Thank you.
That's really, I think, a very beautiful set of findings. So I know you said you weren't going to talk about the subordinate stuff, but for me that's a Dalmatian. And I noticed that some of your participants said that too. And I'm wondering if it's actually the subordinate level that might be driving some of the adult-kid differences. So I get corrected by my 4-year-old about whether car entails truck, things like that, because of his specialist domain knowledge, which we know matters for basic level categorization. So can you talk about the role of particularly kids' individual experience, maybe dip into subordinate answer that as you will.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question because I do have a slide on this.
All right.
So let me say one thing. So we had a post-experiment norming phase where we just wanted to see whether children of this age range demographic know the basic level terms, right? So that's what we do find. So this is a data from a post-experiment task where we asked kids, brought the same images back and said, how would you call them, right? Like, it's your turn. Right? Like, thanks for playing with Mr. Lion, it's your turn. And they respond mostly at the basic level, but what you'll notice is they also respond sometimes at the subordinate level, which might not seem surprising, but for adults, they never do that. They never say Dalmatians, or they sometimes say Dalmatian, but some other of these items are like chocolate chip cookies. Adults just say cookies, children say chocolate chip cookies. Or sometimes they see butterflies, children say monarch butterflies. Adults never say that. So I think that is something interesting going on there. We didn't exactly look at what might be going on there, but you're right that there is, children have a kind of a more, I don't know, like pure and kind of quirky relationship with these category level labels, whereas I think adults might, be tempted to just dismiss it as, oh, everything happens at the basic level.
I want to push back against that very, very slightly, although I mostly agree. There are domains where adults will be like weirdly divergent, and the place that I've been thinking about this is picture name agreement for production. People call things all kind of things, and it's a lot of it's subordinate labels. So if you want to talk more, I can help you come up with items.
Yeah, that's great.
Super
yeah,
rad.
Thank you.
Hi, Jessie Snedeker. I found myself kind of frustrated when you tried to build this parallel between scalar and implicature in this work. And I do see the way in which they're parallel. Very surface level, you have a phenomenon where kids are different from adults, where there's underinformativity at stake, and you give them 3 options and focus them on form, and they look more adult-like. The problem is that their initial unadult-likeness was in the exact opposite direction, right? In scalar implicature, children are accepting the sentences, not rejecting them, and adults are rejecting them. And then in the subordinate, superordinate, it's exactly the opposite that is happening, right? And this to me seems like really interesting and really important for understanding what's happening at a process level. I mean, for one, the Napoleon Katso's pragmatic tolerance, kids are just really much nicer people than we are, always struck me as a little bit weak, and this definitely seems to push against that. What are your thoughts about how the 2 cases are similar and different and how you can account for it?
Yeah, so it probably boils out to the question of like the accessibility of alternatives, and I think it just might be the case that in the domain of like nominals, what lexical alternatives are accessible might play out differently. So what I don't do here is I don't try to prove or disprove the existence of the basic level or explain it away, but it seems like there's something about the fact that the basic level is privileged in the noun domain that. Yeah. Oh, I just meant like, it just seems to kind of converge that way. So whether you're starting from the subordinate or the superordinate, the basic level kind of controls the scalar implicature. That gets generated, and then you do a kind of reasoning over that. So what I mean to say is, you don't always prefer the subordinate, even though that's might be the most informative. And I think that's just like something with this domain that makes this a little tricky. So that is why I kind of left the parallel very surface level. I guess I don't have a really good answer to this other than I kind of agree that it was a very surface level connection. But I want to kind of try to investigate that more definitely in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Victor, Harvard. Hi, June. Thanks, great stuff. So I have a question which is maybe not super fun, but is, so you kind of bite the bullet and say you need to be able to know these contrasts conceptually to get this off the ground. And I guess I'm wondering whether you also need to know some things about the words and their relations, unless you assume there's some kind of stuff going on conceptually that gets some facts about like X is a kind of Y off the ground for you. Right, so if you maybe additionally need to know that not just conceptually is a dog kind of an animal, but can you say something like a dog is a kind of an animal, like in language, if you can, is that what you mean by concept versus language? Like, there's this question of the relationship between dog and animal conceptually, right. And then what we might know is like facts, like a dog is a kind of animal. And so, some people want to put animal and dog, or animal in dog, right? But I guess the reason this comes out kind of in this work is I'm wondering, when we talk about like scales kind of like came up, people are usually okay thinking there's some kind of psychological reality to them or something. And I guess my question is, how do you learn, or how does this come out?
Yeah.
I don't know, in the process of
From
development.
the conceptual side, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is like a whole nother debate that I don't have a lot of bearing on, but I will say that there is some literature suggesting that children actually start at the superordinate level. Like they start with the superordinate levels of categories, and then they start drawing distinctions downstream. So the basic level is derived from, right, so you start with the higher level categories, you start defining the narrower ones, and then in that process you establish the entailment relationship. What becomes tricky is then why are superordinate nouns hard in the domain of language, right? And this is kind of something that I'm trying to insert myself into this debate and try to say that, superordinate nouns are hard in language for language-specific reasons. It might be language internal reasons about when we talk about these broader categories that make them hard, as opposed to, children might not have the category. So I guess back to the conceptual debate, I think there is literature that I agree with that, you start with the superordinate, you make further distinctions downstream, and then that establishes the relationship as you go through that route.
Awesome,
If that
thanks.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Sarah Branchmet Vanderbilt. I'd like to push back against the comparison with scalar, but for a different reason than was previously articulated. I think if you think about the usage of superordinate terms in ordinary language use, they're a type of tool that is used quite differently than these other terms. So is a slime mold an animal? Is an appropriate type of use of that term? If we're playing 20 questions, is it an animal? Is it a mineral? Is an appropriate use of that term? But when you're given a referential context with 3 airplanes and a frog, because it's always a frog, I was told. Talking about it as an animal is inappropriate because we've already established that we have distinctions within category in at least one conceptual domain, and then we have this other conceptual domain. So I wonder if I love the switch to questions, but I think it's the wrong question. I think is perhaps a better domain. I wonder if you're looking at this using the wrong tools.
Yeah, I think I should say, so when children do the amelioration, I think that's precisely when they don't do the kind of scalar implicature, which is generate the basic level alternative and then say that animal is underinformative because Mr. Lyon could have said dog instead. So I think for that, this is more of a relevance question of, superordinate level contrast becomes relevant in what to mention, and then that's no longer like a scalar question, but I think it's, at least for the first experiment when we kind of established the scales and found that very surface level parallel to the Katzis and Bishop work, I think that's might be where my strong stance begins and ends. So yeah, I'll go back to think more about that though. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, John Druswell, University
Hello.
of Pennsylvania. You know who I am. Yeah. So I had a slightly different question about the use of the superordinates in these studies, because one thing that I've always wondered about any of studies with contrasts, with referential sets that are contrasts, is that in the cases like the choice of the other 3 alternatives, you actually, for the superordinate, have a diverse set of items. It's different kinds of vehicles, and in the other, it's cats. And so would you expect an additional role for something like a level priming effect? So imagine you had 3 race cars as the alternative. They're not animals, but they are a specific kind of vehicle. Would that encourage the use of dog more?
That's a very good question. So if you have something very specific, you might have construed the alternatives at a specific level,
Yeah.
and then you draw the contrast, which gets you to think at a more specific level for the target.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. I might think that could be possible. I think if we sufficiently engage the child's kind of like language system enough that they try to construe something linguistically, like in their minds, then I think that is very, very possible thing to happen because we would, because what I would predict is children's judgments are mostly made on the basis of what else could have been said. That's kind of what I was trying to get at with the scale. So yeah, that's a really interesting manipulation I could do. Yeah, thank you.
All right, let's thank our speaker.